Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. See, there are a few people here already, so thank you for joining in. Welcome. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Let me know in the chat if there are any audio or visual hiccups. Let me set the chat overlay on. I thought I would take this lunchtime stream to do a primer on hexcrawling. If you have any questions as I'm going through things, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm happy to go in whatever directions seem to come, but I thought that the main topic would be a primer. I thought it would be helpful. Some of my videos, if you've seen them before, they go into a lot of detail, rambling about hex crawls, and I think sometimes that there are maybe some main points that either get I'm not lost, but end up being kind of deep into the mix in these videos. So I thought I could put together something that's a little bit more concise, and then just see where people are at with their hex crawling and see what questions I can answer. Devious Dungeon Painting forgot he was here, and I scared the heck out of him. Well, good for that. I'm happy to scare you, keep you on your toes, keep you awake. So, just to start from the beginning, just to in case folks are in here now or in the future, I just have no idea what a hex crawl is. Really, a hex crawl is essentially another term for an overland campaign or overland aspects of the campaign in which your players may be wandering through the wilderness or not, just through the landscape in general to get from point A, wherever they are starting, to some point B. It could be in an exploratory mode where they don't know exactly where point B is and they're trying to find it, or simply just to somewhere that's either close by or far away. The reason we call it a hex is because the basic tool for the GM to help visualize and run these types of overland travel campaigns, and it could be over water, ultimately just travel campaigns, is the use of hexes, and they call maps made of hexes hex maps, and they call, when you're moving around these maps, crawling the maps, or hex crawling. So we get hex crawling. I like to use 6-mile hexes. So we have these hexes, we're creating our map. I guess let me back up first. A hex is an abstraction. When we're looking at a hex map, we're looking at a collection of these hexes. The hexes themselves are abstractions. They are not the terrain, right? The map is not the territory. The hexes is not even the map. If you're looking at, here's the actual landscape, then one level abstracted up is the, say, cartographic map, which is more or less accurate, depending if we're using modern maps, accurate, medieval maps, less so, but at least their goal, regardless of who's making the map and when, is to be as accurate as possible to the terrain beneath it. Then another level of abstraction above that is hex map. So whereas a cartographic hex is trying to, as best as it can, give you an actual, in a sense, one-to-one of what you're looking at on that map to what's below, obviously scales notwithstanding, the hex map is more to give you this overview. So when you look at a hex map, you will see there's symbology that will represent the terrain, but it's only representing the dominant terrain, or the terrain that is the most characteristic of the area. It is not trying to describe the only terrain in an area. And I think this potentially throws people for a loop. So I like to use 6-mile hexes. What is a 6-mile hex, or what is when someone says their hex is a given size? We're talking about from, if you start at one plane of the hex and you're moving across to another plane, that would be 6 miles. So it's 6 miles across if you're walking. As I've mentioned in other videos and yesterday on the stream, if you actually look at the square miles, or how many miles actually of area are inside a 6-mile hex, it's 30 some odd miles. So even though it seems small, okay, we're going from one end of the hex to the other, it's only 6 miles. In total, the kind of things that the amount of terrain that's actually in a hex is closer to 30 some odd miles. 6 mile hexes, and you can, there are plenty of articles online with different sizes of hexes. I like the 6 mile hex because I tend to think of in travel, especially we're talking at low levels when you're tending to be horses or on foot. I think of 12 miles as is almost an optimal travel day. If you are on a road and you're going at a good pace and nothing's happening, about 12 miles I think of as about how far you're going to get. So that's 2 hexes. Of course, often the roads aren't straight, conditions aren't perfect, you're not on road at all. So that puts 1 to 2 hexes as your daily travel area. The math works out pretty well with a 6 mile hex. It's 3 miles to the middle. From any plane to the middle, it's 3 miles. From any corner to the middle, it's, I think, 3.5 miles. The math, I think, just tends to work out pretty well with 6 mile hexes for me because, again, the point is it's an abstraction. Your party doesn't see the planes or the corners, that what the vertices of the hexes when they're traveling. They don't have any idea where one hex stops and one hex begins. But the shapes and the math involved allow you as the GM to approximate where they are, about how far they are from things, so that you might say on the map, well, they're, because you might look at a hex map, or the party will never look at a hex map, but you will look at a hex map and say, well, the party's approximately here. Maybe they're near the center of the hex. Maybe they're near an edge. And then you could make some rough match. If they're fairly much near an edge, and I know that where they're going is the middle of the next hex, I could say that's about 3 miles away. Maybe I add a little bit, say 3.5 miles. That's really the purpose of the hex map, is so that you as the GM can approximate distances on a meta level to then pass on to your players. Because your players, they're not setting up those tripods and with the survey instrumentation and marking everything. They don't need to know the exact distance. And there's no way for them to know the exact distances. So the idea is, well, what we just need to have is reasonable approximations that we can all game with and that you can do quickly. Hey, if I'm near one hex, the other thing's in the middle, near the middle of one hex, the other thing's in the middle of another hex. I know it's 3 miles to the edge of this hex, 3 miles from that edge to the middle, right? So I know it's 6 miles. I can just do that quickly in my brain. That's kind of the benefit of a hex map. The other benefit is to just be able to eyeball your terrain. Maybe you're looking at it, you have a big map, and you're looking at it and you see that the terrain has hills. So you know that generally it's a hilly terrain. Where it can trip you up is just because it says hills. It does not mean that this whole hex from one side to the other is completely wall-to-wall hills with hard boundaries. If there's grasslands in one hex and then hills in the next hex, that there's somehow some hard line of grass to hills. And you might say there are no trees there because I went from a grass hex to a hill hex. So the hills are bare and the grass is like the prairie as far as the eye can see. That's not what it's trying to say. What it's trying to say is if you were to take a map and zoom out, and maybe I'll try to I probably should have done this before, but maybe I'll pull up like a Google Maps. If you were to zoom out to, say, a satellite level, looking down at an area, or maybe satellite's too far away, but looking down at some distance, some height, you're in a helicopter, you're in a plane, you're flying, you look down in an area and you pick a particular area and you say, if I had to pick one thing that this is most representative of this area, what would it be? And then you would say, and then that would be the symbol. And depending on the symbology you use, you can get more granular. Some, I think, particularly older maps will just have, mountain, hill, forest. Maybe they'll have 2 types of forest, one for alpine forest, one for deciduous, maybe coniferous forest, deciduous forest, jungle might be another one. Some I've seen some symbology will have hills with trees on it, so that if you wanted to indicate that this is a forested hill region versus some that may be more rocky hills, you can do that. You can pick all these things. It's really entirely up to you how granular you want to be or how simple you want to be with the symbology. But ultimately, no matter what you choose, you have to go in with the understanding is that whatever terrain I'm in, it's just a general terrain, and take inspiration from the real places that you live or that you've visited. Even within a couple of miles of something, you might see changes in the terrain. They're not changes, necessarily large scale changes. It might be very contained. I'm normally in New York City. If that were a hex, New York City would definitely be just a city symbol, or whatever metropolitan symbol. But that doesn't mean that there's no green. That doesn't mean that there's no rivers. That doesn't mean there are no hills. That it's just flat grid city. It just means that when you look at it from a distance, the thing that pops out to you most is the city part. So when you're moving your party into a hex, you as the GM have to take that hex and flesh it out. And you can flesh it out beforehand. It just comes down to somewhat how you want to prepare your hex crawling. If you know, my party's starting out in New York City, they're going to be going to Washington, D.C. So I have my basic hexes, which, remember, are these zoomed out features, but I know that they're not moving through it zoomed out. They're moving through it at ground level. So now I have to think about, at ground level, what does it look like? Well, from a zoomed out level, you might say New York City, we're talking an island, it's got a river, then it's mostly forest, farmland, and plains. I think we might get to another couple of rivers, and then we get to DC, and maybe there's some hills thrown in there. But if you actually, in a zoomed in level, you're going through what would be New Jersey, potentially Delaware. I think actually you don't have to New Jersey, and then Pennsylvania, and then maybe there you touch Maryland, and then you get to the District of Columbia. When you're driving through there, you'll see lots of different elements. You have the not only the rivers, but the pine barrens, this kind of swampy areas around the river. Obviously, there are hills and valleys, and besides the big rivers, like say the Delaware River or the Hudson River, you're also going to have lots of little rivers, little streams. There's going to be elevation changes. Nothing's going to be flat just for miles and miles and miles. This isn't Texas. You're going to have lots of ups and downs and places where the ground creases, and there might be a little bits of water running through those creases. And of course, even the forested regions are going to look different depending on where you are. There's lots of these details, and maybe this is where it can become a little bit daunting, because a hex map, when you're just looking at the map itself, looks very simple. 8 or 9 different terrains, and you see those 8 or 9 things splayed out on your map in some kind of distribution. Great. When you actually get down into it, suddenly you've gone from this very easy, simple, simplistic view to a view that now you have to fill with tons and tons of details, and that can be daunting. So if you find that you are outside your comfort zone in terms of the terrain, right? So I'm in the Northeast US. I tend to visualize a lot of things, a lot of terrain like I'm used to seeing up here that I'm more familiar with. If now I have to visualize a jungle, I need to reach a bit further, because now I'm thinking about, well, what might I have seen in TV, on nature shows? What if did I see a Nova show on the jungle that might come in handy? Have I seen some movies on jungles that I could pull from? But that's a little bit further removed. Maybe mountains are even further removed. Maybe they're closer. Maybe the desert is something that I'm even less familiar with. So what do you do in those instances? Well, use your imagination. If it helps, watch some things and take notes. If you know that your party is going to be moving through a desert region and you know that's coming up, then maybe read some Wikipedia entries on deserts and desert biomes, or watch some shows that take place in the desert. Think of those things. And then you're going to put it all together, and you're going to put that out in front of your party. Now, someone, I forget whom, I apologize, asked me in another video that they'd love to see a hex crawl in action to kind of see how it works. My game that I'm running right now is just a home game. We're just getting together and playing. It's not something that I would want to throw on the internet. I imagine maybe some folks in the chat, or you can put in comments if you've watched or listened to this after the stream, can put some, if they know of any of this. I don't watch a lot of the live plays, so if they know of any live plays that have gone into an overland travel mode, they can throw that in there. I will go through kind of the procedure that I tend to use, just in a general sense. Maybe that will be helpful. It's not going to be kind of in game, but we'll just go through it, and then we can see what comes of it. Fluffy the Griffin. thanks for being here. And yeah, he says congrats on 1K followers, or they. I'm not sure if a Fluffy is a he, she, or they, but thank you. So what I'll do is, if I know they're traveling, they get up in the morning, they get there, you get geared up, they'll head out. I'll ask them essentially, what direction if they're going, if it's not obvious, but so okay, so you're heading out, you're in Munchkin Land, and there's only one way to go. It's the kind of yellow brick road. As long as they're following the yellow brick road or some similar landmarks, I'm not going to concern myself about them getting lost. And this is something, when you read about getting lost mechanics, you have to keep in mind that if there is some landmark that they can reasonably keep in view and keep to, then I'm not going to bother with getting lost. They're not going to, if the road is going and they're following it, I'm not going to roll and say, oh, you suddenly lost the road. No, that doesn't make any sense. But if there is no road, or the road ends, or something like that happens, and they're moving into true wilderness, then I'll start to play more with the getting lost mechanics. But putting getting lost aside for now, I will then do a check-in when they hit lunch. So usually when you're in a dungeon, we think about you're supposed to take a rest after so many, every 60 minutes of travel in a dungeon, you're supposed to rest for 10, or you're supposed to rest every 10 minutes out of 60. I don't stick to that in a wilderness travel scenario unless they're pushing themselves, because I'm going with that 12-mile pace, more or less. And that to me is, you're taking rests, you're kind of doing that. But you're going to take sort of a larger break at lunch. And that's where I will generally do a check-in with the players, assuming that they haven't done any specific actions that warrant other things happening, assuming there's no encounters that have happened. If they're just traveling, I will try to set the scene, give them a lay of the land. If there's anything that's interesting in any of the senses, and this is, I like to try to be a little bit, talk about, if applicable, if they're having a feeling about it, the wind blows cold, and for some reason it seems to get right into your bones, right? I can start to set not only just the physical scene of what's happening, but if there's other elements. Excuse me, my throat has gone dry. If there are other elements that I want to bring in, this is where I can talk about them. But that spiel is only going to take me a minute, 2 minutes. I can't imagine taking more than 5 minutes to kind of give off that spiel. If the terrain is staying essentially the same in general, I'll talk about, okay, you're moving into the hill country. So maybe I talk about how the hills are slowly growing larger in scope until you see the highest peaks. Maybe the ground changes. If there's changes with the trees that I think are happening, if there either aren't trees and now you're seeing trees, or there were trees and the trees are dying down, or if anything's happening with the grasses, I'll try to bring up some of that stuff. Mention that as they're going. We get to lunch, they break for lunch, reset things, reset where they are. If anything has changed that's going to impact them, this is maybe a time to bring it up. For example, I know that weather is coming in, and maybe the morning wasn't hitting, but I'll make definitely sure to tell them at noon, hey, it's lunch, you're settling down, but you can smell the ozone is in the air. You see dark clouds billowing along the far hilltops, but the wind is blowing in your direction. It's coming. This way they can start to plot their afternoon if they're going to do something differently. If they're not doing anything differently, if they're operating, however they're operating is happening, is remaining the same, and nothing's changing and no information's come to light, nothing, then they keep moving. And then the next check-in I will do, again, if nothing is happening, is when they start to camp, and then I will reset exactly where they are. So yeah, during the couple of minutes I spend going from lunch to dinner, assuming nothing else is happening, whatever's happening to the landscape, however the landscape's changing, the character of the land, again, whatever characteristics I want to bring in the atmosphere, all that stuff, I will mention it. Now it's, okay, where do you want to camp? I will reset more precisely where they are. So they've been moving into the hill country, but right at this moment, they're in, say, a shallow valley that has boulders sort of around the rim. The slopes here are quite steep and very rocky, with only a few trees that are jutting out of the hillsides at odd angles. There is the tiniest rivulet of water that goes through the middle of this cut that they have been walking in. Where do you want to camp? Right now, I would say, okay, light is starting to fade. You guys thinking about camping? I'll give them the option. Hey, if you want to travel through the night, you're welcome to figure that out. I think they've only taken me up on that once, and only because they were really in a hurry to get to town and they were going somewhere safe. But I will say, hey, night is starting to fall. What are you guys doing? Where would you like to camp? And then they can go through and do their camping procedures and that. And then that's the end of that day of travel. We'll pick it up the next day and it starts over again. Okay, you guys wake up, the sun, whatever time they get up, the sun hasn't come out yet, or the sun is coming up. What's the weather like? Reset that terrain again. Remember where you are. You're in a valley with the boulders and the few trees and the small rivulet, and you have a kind of this clear path into the hill country. Do you change anything from the day before? Yes. Okay, we'll talk through those changes. No. Okay, we can keep doing what we're doing and moving along. And that just continues until they get where they're going. If you find that the scale of what they're doing, you're doing an Oregon Trail type campaign, and you know they're going to be traveling for months. I think I talked about in one of my earlier streams, not maybe the stream before last, right? About, hey, don't go bigger than you need to be and don't force people to go from New York to California if there's no reason to. But that being said, if you say, hey, we want to do this kind of Oregon Trail type thing, then feel free to abstract multiple days of travel, because again, we can zoom out on that map. You can even make your hex scales bigger and say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about breaking for lunch and breaking for dinner. I'm just going to worry about what's happening either once a night, right? We're just going to go through, we're going to abstract out a full day's worth of travel, and I'm only going to mention how gradually over that span the overall geography is changing. If there's something of interest, I'll mention it. If there isn't, I won't, and then we'll deal with that. Or you could say a week, or you could say a month. You can really zoom it out however you need to. Scare, hope I'm pronouncing that right, 75 says, how do you run getting lost? Is it just a time resource penalty, or do you move them to another hex? How do you keep the players in the dark as to where they are if they like to track on a map? So, we'll talk about getting lost now. So I've given you now the general procedure of you're running a hex and everything is going from the player's perspective about as smoothly as they can go. So what if you're getting lost? I will use the rolls. I usually use the ones that are in BX. I forget, I don't have it in front of me, whether it's a 1 and 2 out of 6. I will usually check once a day, but or when. So you're going to get a lot of different opinions, I think, from a lot of different people, depending on how they do it. I'm usually kind of in the once a day, or when there's a reasonable change to the terrain that changes your navigational view. So let me give another example here, right? Lord of the Rings, I think when I was on a stream with Daniel from Bandits Keep, when we were talking about treasure maps, we kind of joked about the sort of uselessness of the map to the Lonely Mountain before the secret is revealed, because it just shows this giant mountain, which you could probably see for 200 miles, I don't know, some crazy distance, 100 miles. So you'd have to be pretty darn far away to not be able to just pick a direction and say, oh yeah, we could see the mountains over there. We just keep moving, right? So how do you get lost? If your only goal is to get somewhere to the Lonely Mountain, it's really hard to get lost if you have a view towards the Lonely Mountain. If you lose your view towards the Lonely Mountain, then that becomes more difficult, or you can't see it yet. So obviously, when you're traveling through Mirkwood, you can get lost. If you're at Lake Town and the mountain's right there, even if it's pretty far away, but the fact is there's nothing obstructing your view of the Lonely Mountain, and that is your goal and your signpost, then there's no getting lost. As Fluffy the Griffin says, how do you lose a mountain? Right. Kind of tough. So you have to play getting lost by ear. So you have to look at, okay, they're heading towards Lonely Mountain, but now they're traveling through a forest. And while they're in the forest, they no longer have the Lonely Mountain in view. That's when I will roll some dice and see, are they getting lost? If they are getting lost, it's not about them shifting hexes. It's basically, you have to think about it like, as far as the hex map goes, or however you're abstracting it, there's a vector, right? You have a vector of travel. When you get lost, they think they're going on that vector. So say, I'm just going to make it easy. Say they're going north. They're on this north vector, Lonely Mountain, but there's forest in the middle. So the end of that forest, they get lost, that vector shifts. Now, instead of going true north, they're going northeast, and they're heading that way. Now, when they're lost, they don't know they're lost. So they're looking at their map, or they're drawing their map as they go. It's not going to change. Their map's not going to change. They're not suddenly going to know they're going northeast instead of north. So whatever you're telling them, they just know, okay, you're continuing to follow your path. These things are happening, blah, 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 blah. It's going to be only when at some point they realize they're lost that they're going to have to figure out how far off course are they? When did they get lost? All that kind of stuff, right? And I'm you see that in movies. We've gone off course. We have to make a sighting, however they need to do it, right? This is the Bilbo climbing up to the top of a tree in Mirkwood to actually get a sighting to see where they are in terms of the Lonely Mountain. Those are the kind of actions that your players will have to do to try to figure out when they got lost or how lost they are. And when they figure that out, it's going to be somewhat up to them to decide. And it's also going to depend on what they know about the overall map. If I know that this is not going to be true to Middle Earth geography, so apologies in advance, but if they know that Lonely Mountain is here and it's basically surrounded by plains, it's kind of a funky mountain, kind of all by itself, and then the Iron Hills are over here, and they were going north towards the Lonely Mountain, but they hit that forest, and then they found off course, and suddenly they're finding themselves in hills. That might be a trigger to them. Whoa, we're not supposed to be hitting hills. We're supposed to hit that forest, come through, then we're supposed to see the ruined city of Dale, and then beyond Dale, we're supposed to see the Lonely Mountain. We are not supposed to be running into hill country. So something's happened. When that happens, then they can start to try to do a sighting. Presumably, in this example, they could try to find a high point in the hills, sight for the Lonely Mountain, find it, and say, okay, now we've got to turn, go a whole other direction, and get there. So you have to play the getting lost by ear a little bit. You have to just determine those, not only the geographical changes, what are they using as their signpost, their guiding light, so to speak, right? What are they navigating by? What has changed to put an obstacle to that navigation method? What other tools are they using, if any? And then determining, okay, does this mean that they could be getting lost? Yes or no? If it's yes, roll dice. If it's not, continue. And I say that because if there was a road, let's say they started at Lake Town, and there's that wood between the lake and the old ruined city of Dale, and there's a road that runs straight through the woods, then even though they can no longer see Lonely Mountain, they're following the road. And unless the road is curving off to hill country for some reason, even though it's been established that it runs to Dale, then that negates that element of the navigation being lost. Yes, the Lonely Mountain is obstructed. They can't see it, but they have the road, and they know the road leads to Dale. And if the road does in fact lead to Dale, then they're not going to get lost as long as they could follow the road. But if the road were to go halfway into the woods and the road disappears, and now there is no sight line to the mountain, and there is no real sight line to the road, and the road curves, it's not perfectly straight, so they can't just go, well, the road was going that way beforehand, so we'll just keep going that way, and that will help us. Plus, once you lose sight of it in 10 feet anyway, that no longer applies, then you're going to start making your rolls. Ovaltine Patrol says, could refer to direction in clock terms to obfuscate specific direction. The tree lines that you're not. Yes, you can do that. You can also use left or right. I would usually say it's ahead of you, it's to your left, it's to your right, it's behind you. And I do that in dungeons too, but you can also definitely do it in the wilderness. Really force the players to make those either have the tools like a compass or have the wherewithal to say, okay, we mark where the sun was when we got up and we mark where it sets. So we have our east-west, assuming that your sun moves in the same direction as we think about in Earth terms, right? You make those sightings and then you establish it, and we're reestablishing it. There are many things they can do. Put it on the players to come up with that. And then if they don't, then you can use the clock. You can use left, right, front, back. Clock is probably good because it gives you a lot more granularity, right? In terms of the directions you can use. So getting lost, you will determine based on all these factors I went over, is there a chance they get lost? Then you could use whichever roll you like to get lost. I don't know, 1 to 2 out of 6, I think is what I usually use. Obviously, you want to take into account any fictional positioning besides just any tools they've done, if depending on what kind of heritage what kind of creatures your players are, what kind of classes they may have, and if you're using backgrounds or skills, that may enter it also in terms of what kind of roll you make. But you'll make that roll. If they get lost, you'll figure out, well, how lost are they? And I usually think of a term, I don't know, what is it, like not 180 degrees, but maybe 90 degrees in some way, because unless the things are really confusing, you're not immediately going to get turned around, right? You're not going to be going one direction, you get lost, and you're suddenly going the other direction. You might do a circle, realize it, and after a while, because you can make multiple getting lost turns or checks, right? So you could keep that direction. Just because you're starting off lost going northeast doesn't mean you don't keep turning, but you're not generally going to get stop and go, oops, and then turn around and not know you're going backwards. So I usually will go in that kind of like a 90-degree variation, but then I can keep making checks. And you can keep making those checks as often as you feel like it. Really, you probably want to depend on how abstracted you're going. If you're doing weeks of travel, then you could probably have 360 degrees, because over a week, you can get really lost and you can get turned around and re-going the other direction on that kind of scale. When I'm talking, hours in a day, I will probably do multiple checks to see if they are lost, if that direction is still changing. And I'll also probably make some kind of check depending on what I think is available for them. If they can not necessarily know what direction they've been heading, but if they do get the inkling that they're lost, especially if they do end up wrapping around and maybe crossing a path that they took already, maybe they'll run into their own tracks, and you can have fun. You can have some fun with that if they end up running across their own tracks from several hours ago, trying to figure out if they were being trailed or what kind of party or what kind of monsters or whatever are out there, and it turns out being themselves. So you really want to just find a cycle, find a period of time that works in the time scales that you're running for how often you want to check. I hope that helped with the getting lost part. Let's see. Fred, nice to see you, Fred, says, so I'm hearing is to use some common sense while adjudicating travel and getting lost. Yes, that is probably a better way, a less rambling way of saying what I was saying. Yes, definitely use your common sense. It draws towards being a simulation when we use the real world as a model for gaming. I'm okay with this. Right. Obviously, it is a game, and there are going to be some things that might vary from the real world for X, Y reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately within the game, we want the simulationist parts help because they all ground us in the same reality, right? We all know about how far things away from other, how far we can walk in a given period, all these things we know. So we want to use that knowledge so that we can think about what our characters would do, because our characters, despite all the fantastical elements, live in some version of our world. The gravity is about the same. We have the same we have the sun that's going to be moving in the same direction. The days are the same length. All the things are more or less the same. And some settings could be particularly gonzo and just throw all that away. And when you have those, it is harder to get into that mindset of, well, if I'm playing John Carter of Mars, what are the distances like on travel on Mars when I'm John Carter and I can leap for half a mile at a time? That kind of changes scope. Or I can leap in the air a mile and I can get that view of my surroundings that I could not do if I was playing a Middle Earth based role-playing game. Also says some rule systems support comparison reality better than others. Yes, of course. So I think ultimately you want to sort of use reality as your guide unless your setting specifically contradicts it, right? So when we think of having a sun in a game, we generally think of the sun moving east to west, unless the setting specifically says, nope, this sun moves in no direction at all, or it moves randomly, or it moves from north to south, right? If nobody tells you that, you're going to tend to say, okay, the sun goes east to west, and we're going to take that as given. And that's kind of what you would do with any sort of travel thing. We know about, or we can imagine kind of our speed of foot travel or our speed of horse travel. So we just use those unless we say, hey, these horses are different than our horses, or you're riding a giant caterpillar and that does something else. Then we'll try to figure out that new common ground. But barring any contradictory things, usually our basis is Earth. So that's where we don't have any other basis for all our shared experiences. So that's it. So let me, for those who may have joined more recently, so I've kind of covered just an overview of hexcrawling and hex maps and 6 mile hexes and their usefulness. I've covered just the general procedures of traveling day to day. I've covered getting lost. Now, I only mentioned in passing that I think I use 1 to 2 out of 6. Different OSR rule systems are going to have different mechanics. Go with the one that you like the best, the one that fits. The nice thing with OSR is all these rules, you can kind of place them into different, you can basically take these system mechanics and swap them around as you see fit. So if you're running Troika, but you don't like the way Troika handles getting lost, if they handle it all, I haven't read through all of Troika, so I'm not aware. Then if you like how Lamentations of Flame Princess does it better, or Old School Essentials, or good old BX, or the white box, just swap them in, right? Plunk it in, fill what you need from something else. The first edition DMG, it's so dense with all kinds of rules, but it's nice because if you need something, it's probably in there. In that book, and then the Rule Cyclopedia, I think, are great references for if you need a rule that isn't covered in another book, and you're wondering where might be the best place to find it, and you don't want to go searching the blogosphere, or you just want to find something has the the authenticity of being a official TSR kind of rule. Those two books, I think if you combine them, will have variations on just about everything you could possibly need as far as rules. There's also the Wilderness Survival Guide is a book. I believe it is available on drive-thru. There's way more stuff in there I think you need. I'm kind of curious if anyone back in the day ever played with all that stuff in there. However, it's got in the back of the book, it has a random weather generator using some tables that I think is pretty good. I've used before. Donjon, .bin.ish, the Donjon site has a weather generator you can use, but it's got a lot of resources in there. I find a lot of these books inspirational. I don't necessarily use the rules in them themselves, but they might say, oh, that's a great idea, and let me see. I think usually in the DMG, it's like, okay, this is too complicated. I don't want to do all of that, but I see the kernel of something I like, so I will pull that kernel out and use it. I tend to go with simplicity. So with weather, I'll usually roll 2 weather, and I know there's some other weather ones. I usually like to try to. I know there was one out there. I don't know if it was a hex flower or kind of a drunkard's walk style weather generator, but I prefer the weather generators that build off of the weather from the previous day. I think the Donjon one does, but I don't recall exactly. So I like that if it's sunny, it's more likely to have sort of smaller changes to the weather and less likely to go from sunny to raging thunderstorm. Not that it can't, but just less likely. That way, I feel like from day to day, as I'm talking about the weather, I get those, what I feel like would be the gradations you see of the weather when you're actually seeing it coming and going on a minute to minute basis. I think nowadays, you're in your house, you're in your apartment, you're doing stuff, it's sunny, and then you're working, and then you wake, and then you get up a few hours later, and now looks like it's got a thunderstorm. But if you were actually walking through an area that wasn't just overbuilt and urban, you'd have a lot better. You'd see it a lot. You see it coming a lot further away. You would see on the far horizon the clouds building up before they cruised on over. So I like to kind of use that as far as weather systems, but I'll generally do kind of either a day-to-day check or maybe a morning, evening check. I do a lot of stuff in that kind of morning, evening, and then when you are moving into different terrains. So if you have been in a mostly forest hex and you're moving into a hill hex, I might check the weather again. That's also where I'll check for random encounters again. I get into wandering monsters, random encounters. I go back and forth on what I call them. I guess since I can talk about that now, since I'm thinking about it. So I check for weather once kind of in the morning, once in the evening, kind of giving that sort of showing just gives me an idea of how the weather is changing over the period of the day, so it can feel dynamic. And then I like to do my wandering monster checks once for diurnal stuff that's around during the day, and then once for the night, because I think it just has that more dynamic stuff. What stuff comes out at night versus what stuff is around during the day. And then also I will do additional rolls if you are passing into different dominant terrain. So there's the stuff that's in the forest, and then even though I may have rolled already for a wandering monster check, if you're moving into the hills, I'm going to roll another wandering monster check because there's different stuff in the hills that might not have been active in the woods, but they're there in the hills, so I want to see how those things interact. One thing that's fairly important, I think it's important regardless of if you're doing wandering monsters in the dungeon or in the wilderness, is roll for how far they are away. You can use different scales. I think by default, I want to say they were saying that it's like 10 times, maybe it was 3 times. It's the yards instead of feet. So if you were rolling for 30 to 180 feet, basically 3d6 times 10 feet in the dungeon, it would be 3d6 times 30 feet or 3d6 times 10 yards outdoors. I think the distances are important because it really gives your party options on how to handle it. It gives you as a GM potentially just more room to establish these things. You can, if you want to add something about, which I've done in the past at times, is you can add a time element to it. So you're rolling for a wandering monster. Let's say you roll one up. You can roll for a time. How close to it now being, or how close to now were they here, right? One option is, no, they're here right now. Another, maybe at the other end of the table is, or however you want to do your dice, is it was 4, 6, 8 hours ago. Then you can talk about trace elements. And then as I'm talking about the terrain, I can talk about if it's more wild creatures, maybe they find stool, maybe they find kills, maybe they find an old bedding where it's something had laid down to rest, or maybe they find broken branches, or they find tracks, or whatever those things. And of course, the closer they get to the actual creature, if the creature's either nearby or they follow them, then I can start to build up more about that kind of atmospherics around that creature, which of course also lets me potentially use creatures that I might not, or that it's that balance. I guess it's really that balancing feature, right? So you look at the old wilderness encounter tables, is you can run into kind of anything at any time. Dragons, rocks, wyverns, giants, things that depending on the level of your party could be way above their pay grade unless they're super smart. And you're thinking, well, these are random, they could just kind of pop up. How do I establish that context that allows the party to make an intelligent decision, whether to investigate or approach or retreat or do whatever? And the answer is by using those distances as an aid. Sometimes you can't help it. They're going to roll and it's going to be 30 yards, which, is 90 feet. So it's not super close, but it's not that far away either. And that's just how it happens sometimes. Sometimes you're going to be walking through the woods, you're going to enter a clearing and there's a giant, doing something, coming from the other direction, hadn't set up camp yet. So there's really no traces in the find, but they just bump into you, you bump into them. That's really where you're rolling that surprise. Who's surprised? Giant surprise, the party's surprised, or both. But you're more likely going to get more distance than that. And that gives you a chance to set up, what do they hear? What do they smell? What do they see? All these elements to give them a much more choice about how to approach the encounter. There are rules in different books. I think definitely in the Wilderness Survival Guide. I think I'm saying that right. I think in BX, pretty sure, maybe not in BX, I think definitely in the white box about essentially running away in the wilderness, trying to lose something that's chasing you, and some options you can do. There are dungeon options too, which I think you can use just as well. And I always lament that a lot of those rules didn't make it into later editions. Stuff like if an intelligent monster is chasing you, drop something that's treasure, drop some loot, drop something valuable. They might just take it and stop, kind of like you're paying them off to stop chasing you. And then if it's a not intelligent creature, drop food, something else to eat, and it might stop chasing you as well. We can obviously use those things in the wilderness. Also, I think it's good to let the players know about a lot of these mechanics so that they can think about them. Because yes, it makes sense in the fiction if a wild, a panther or cougar is chasing you and you have a hunk of meat in your pocket to throw the meat behind you and run. But sometimes it's nice for players to be able to see the mechanical part and actually say, oh, there is a mechanical thing I can do here. I will do that. So I like to make that stuff player facing. And I think they usually tend to be in the player facing sides of the books when I've seen them. So it's not that they were not meant to be player facing. It's just that often, sometimes the GMs, we don't surface them to our players, particularly if our players don't own the books that we own. If I have the Wilderness Survival Guide, but my players don't, especially when we're playing remotely. I can't just hand the book over to them to read. So it's really up to me to kind of take the elements that I'm using and tell your players, hey, I'm using these things. Way back in the day, there was that Avalon Hill game called, was it Wilderness Survival? That had some interesting rules. You can find stuff in the blogosphere about using those. Some of the rules they have in the game are integrated because they had great rules for things like water and food and getting dehydrated. I think maybe even getting lost as well. And I know there's been some stuff written. If I can find stuff, I'll put it in the show notes as far as some of the resources that people have taken out of that Wilderness Survival. It actually had the original hex maps that were used. I think in the white box, they would say, hey, go here for the hex maps. And that was literally what some of those earliest gaming tables would use, is they would literally use the hex map from that game. And there were kind of camp areas that were on that game, and those would be where towns and settlements were. And it's kind of a weird map. I guess no weirder than Middle Earth when you look at it from a geographical perspective, but it had a lot of different features in it. And they would just say, hey, here's where, I think Blackmore might have used it too. Like, here's where Blackmore is, or here's where Castle Grailk is, and here's what these different things are. And had some good rules in there. So that's if you want to get super granular about it. I tend to think in, when I look at a lot of areas as when in the Northeast US, right? You're going through woods and hills, and you're not in the mountains necessarily. But I tend to think up in this part of the country, water's fairly easy to come by. So I don't tend to get super into you're running out of your water and you're going to die now if you don't find water in a couple of days, because usually you'll find little streams, ponds, pools, all these different things. They're kind of all there. But if you're in the desert, if you're in somewhere else that's important, you want to then find the rule that you'll need. And to the extent that you can plan this stuff in advance, if you know they're at the borders of my fantasy Sahara, and I know that they're going in because that's where the dungeon is, or that's whatever's going, then find those rules up front. Okay, I'm going to use this mechanic for dehydration, and also tell your party about it. Don't keep it to yourself. Tell them so that they know, that they can prep for it. And so when stuff happens, they're on top of it. Maybe that will, because it will definitely, or it should alter their planning. And my parties have tended to get into the planning for expeditions, planning for travel. So if your players tend to do that as well, then they want to know that. So they'll know to be sure, okay, I need to bring X amount of water skins because we're going to go through however many, 2 people or whatever, 1 water skin per 2 people per day. And then we're in the desert. There's not going to be anywhere till we get to the other side to refill it. I can start making the calculations, which says I'm going to need 15 water skins. And therefore I'm going to need to get so many camels to carry, amongst other things, all these heavy water skins. And you'll see that having them prepare for one thing will set the gears in motion for preparing for lots of other stuff, which then just gives you more things to play off of in your adventures. Because if they're going from 5 guys just walking, or 5 ladies, a group of 5 walking into the desert by themselves, versus now we've got 5 of them, we've got 3 camels, we got a guy who's there to essentially a camel driver, we have a couple of mercenaries to guard the camels and the camel driver. That makes for a lot more dynamic, interesting, fun hex crawl than just the adventuring party. And I think that often gets lost in kind of the modern game, where they've gotten rid of the necessity for hirelings. Is having all those creatures, people, individuals there just adds a lot more dynamism to the moment. Let me know, is there anything else I haven't covered? I don't want to get too far into the weeds on a particular topic. So far I've got just overview of hex crawling, my procedure for moving through hexes, getting lost, random encounters. I guess I could talk about just building out your hex map. I mentioned this in one of the other videos, but start small. If you don't need a continental US sized map, don't make it. It's very interesting. There was I think it was a book. I didn't read the book, but I read a review of the book. Essentially all about mapping in, I guess, the late Middle Ages, or not even, no, it wasn't. Sorry, it was the Renaissance. We were in the colonial period. And this guy was trying to map areas of France. And he was stoned to death by distrustful villagers. And these villagers, even we're talking into the late 18th century, didn't really see themselves as part of a greater world. not really part of France, certainly not part of a Europe or any kind of larger unit. They really saw themselves in this little world that they were in, and they saw this guy walk in here and start doing things that seemed to them nefarious, and so they killed him as sort of an intruder. And I tell the story because I think that the scale of things we want to do in fantasy, I think we tend to want to think in huge terms. We got to think epic. We got to think, I want to make Middle Earth. It's huge maps and huge everything. But the reality is that if we're dealing with for at least the general populace, a mostly medieval sort of vibe, most of these folks aren't traveling outside their hex. They live and die within 1 6-mile hex. That 30 square miles or whatever it is of that hex, that is about as far as they're ever moving. They got their village that's somewhere in there. Maybe there's another village that's a few miles away. Maybe another one's a few miles away. Maybe there's a market town that's a little bit further, depending on where they are. And that little area encompasses their entire lives. So I don't need to build out a huge amount of hexes to start. There's a lot going on just in that 1 6-mile hex. And then maybe I can just build a few more hexes. I can make a hex flower around that central hex. That's going to give me a lot of material, a lot of ground for me to cover. And I can fill it with stuff. And the players may ask, well, what's beyond those hills? What's over there? Maybe nobody knows. Maybe there are reasons why nobody goes beyond those hills. And if they want to go there and find out, by the time they get there, I can then have put another set of hexes around there, and I can determine what's in that hex. But we don't need to start. And I know it's easy with digital tools. I'm going to be giving away eminently a copy of Worldographer, Hexographer 2. It is very easy to make a planet-sized map that is filled with hexes. And then, in fact, you can keep drilling down until you get to kind of a local level. And then you just have hexes as far as you can almost imagine, enough hexes going on that it starts to choke the power of my laptop to display the map. But what are you going to do with all those hexes? I think there's a sense that you feel like I got to fill them all. I got to figure out all this stuff. Well, you don't, and even if you do just do like a hexographer or worldographer, I just randomly fill out a map. I'll find somewhere to start. Just keep your focus on what's local around them and make that interesting. Put stuff in there for them to experience and adventure. And when they get tired of that, or whether they've done everything that's in there, and you can, please, if you haven't had a chance to, check out the stream I did with Daniel from Bandits Keep yesterday on mega dungeons, because there's kind of an element there too, right? Of you can have these big area mega dungeons that are in a hex that can really give you adventuring possibilities for as long as you want. Don't have to put miles and miles and miles and miles, hundreds of leagues, thousands of miles into hexes if you don't want to. I understand at some point that there's an allure to that grand scale. Then you can build it out at those times, right? You have your little area. Once they get to a certain level, then they'll also start to be unlocking more travel options. Then you can expand out. But just don't feel the need to do it all at once. Whatever's manageable for you, keep that management part in mind. I'm not sure what else I have. I got a few minutes here. I'll probably stop at the top of the hour because that'll be a good hour long. I think I've covered most of the stuff at least in general terms. I'm trying to think if there's anything that is missing. As usual, the blogosphere has tons of blogosphere, Reddit and different places that will aggregate a lot of the stuff from blogs. Has tons of resources. Welsh Piper has great maps there. You just or I should say map templates that you can print out. I think they're in PDF form. You don't worry about the beauty of your map. You can look at some of the old school modules that had hex crawls, and you can see just the very, very simple symbology they use. It doesn't have to be a work of art. It just has to be something that you can understand. And again, you're keeping in mind, like I said at the start, it is an abstraction. Just because the hex says mountain on it doesn't mean it's wall-to-wall mountains. If you need some inspiration, as someone mentioned as a comment on one of the other videos, when they actually took a Google map and looked at it, and you can look at a 6-mile area, you can see, wow, there's a lot of terrain changes in here. Use that as inspiration. If you're going to do a mountains, go look, do Google Earth, zoom in on the Alps and see all the stuff that's in a particular 6-mile, area of alpine terrain, or the Himalayas or the Ozarks, whatever fits, find those models that is going to fit closely to what you have in mind for your fantasy area. Go into Google Earth, we have these awesome resources now. Use them. Go in there and check out what the terrain is like, how much variation there is within a certain area. Wikipedia's got great stuff just in terms of flora and fauna. There are generators out there for, I guess we call them minor obstacles or minor terrain changes. I have the ready reference sheets by Judges Guild. I can no longer recommend that product. There is the D30, I think, Hexcrawling guide. I've linked to it in another stream. I will link it here as well. That has lots of tables and lots of generation methods or just generators in there for different things. One thing you can, if you need inspiration, roll on some tables for things that are not, when I say minor obstacle or minor feature, I guess is the best word. These are things that don't show up on the hex map level, but they might show up on a more detailed cartographic map or be there in reality. So again, we're moving through farmland. Maybe there is a big ravine at some point, or there used to be a river, but the river went dry, but there's still this kind of deep cut in the ground. Maybe there's something like that there. It's not big enough to make it onto those higher abstraction levels, but it's there. Or there's a pool, more stream, small hills. Maybe there's some kind of caves. Maybe there's a natural spring. Maybe you get into kind of a bunch of boulders for no reason. Right? All these little things that can add character to individual areas to help you as you're talking your way through them. If you're looking at a forest hex and your party's at that ground level and you're just kind of looking at it saying, I don't know, I've just described 8 forest hexes and I don't know what's here. Those are good tools you can roll on and say, okay, in this particular area that's in front of them, it's swampy. It's still overall woods, but this is very wet, very swampy. And then that might trigger more things. And usually for me, I get something like that and it kind of kickstarts my inspiration. And that's kind of what sort of gets my engine moving. Then once I go, oh, swampy, okay, now I can start riffing on swamp areas. But those tools are very useful. Find some in advance, bookmark them. That way, when you're running your hex crawl and you need them, they're there. As I've said before, if there's nothing interesting going on and there's no encounters, there's nothing happening, skip ahead, right? They're traveling in the morning. I've rolled on my wandering monsters. I've got nothing. They're going through farmland that is essentially the same farmland that they've seen before. There's nothing unique. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing new. There's nothing novel. I'm not going to sit there and start describing. And then 10 feet later, you see another house. This house has a green door. And then 50 feet later, no. All right, lunchtime. And either the farmland's still going or it's changing. Or if I feel like it, okay, you've gone through lunch, you've gone through dinner, bam. Now you've traveled the rest of the day and now you've made it to the edge of the wild country. So you're out of civilized Munchkin land and now you're into the woods where, we'll run into the Tin Man. And since it's changing and becoming gloomier, now this is when I'm going to pause and now reset the scene. Don't feel like you got to go through and narrate every step or narrate every mile. Please do not determine that every hex they need to have an encounter. From a player perspective, it's going to start to feel like a chore. You want these things to feel dynamic. You want the world to feel lived in. You want the world to reflect the fiction, so that if you're in an area that is lonely and forlorn and there's nothing there, they shouldn't be running into something every other moment. It should feel forlorn. It should be weeks before they see sign of something, if it's that kind of place, or at least days, depending. When you start to just put things in front of your players because you feel like they have to be there, that's when it starts to become a drag, because it becomes clear to the players. Every moment we're doing this, that rhythm. And I think I think of railroading. I think of that rhythm of just like, the train moving over the tracks, ga-dung, 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 right? We take 10 feet, there's an encounter. We take 10 feet, there's an encounter. Or we go 5 miles, encounter. We go 5 miles, encounter. We go 5 miles, encounter. It's just going to be a bore. And it's going to be a bore for you too. And it puts a lot of pressure on those encounters, because you can start thinking, well, if they have to have an encounter, then the encounter has to be really amazing because I'm forcing it on them, whatever. Play it by ear, let it go, let it come and go as it wants to. Just really let go and let the dice do the work for you. And if it's empty, nothing's happening, fast forward. I hope this stuff was useful. I've just seen that I've passed an hour, so I am going to wrap things up here. If you have any more comments or questions or anything that you feel like I didn't cover or you'd like for me to cover in more detail, please leave a comment in the chat, or once this is wrapped up, leave a comment in YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching this, or if you're listening to this in podcast form later on, drop it in any comments where you'll find me. You'll find me just about everywhere. Your Walker X. Hey, thanks for the video and have a good day. Thank you. Thanks for watching and listening. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, all that great stuff. It helps me a lot with the algorithms and all that YouTube nonsense. Also for podcasts, if you do listen to this on podcast form, leave me a review and give me a rating, hopefully a good one. I don't think I have any, so I could use some. It's lonely out there in the podcast arm of the Hex Press empire. But have an awesome rest of your day, night, weekend, weekdays, whenever you're watching or listening to this. I will talk to you later. Cheers.